everyone, this is Amanda Moore from the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, and you're listening to the ASF Podcast, the show that explains everything you want to know about Angelman Syndrome. We're so excited you're here, and we hope you enjoy the show. Okay, guys. Well, welcome back to the Angelman Syndrome Foundation podcast. And you're in for a real treat tonight. I am incredibly excited to have one of my most favorite people in the world, especially in the Angelman Syndrome world, with us tonight. But we're really excited that we're able to share with you a lot more information about the Ladder Learning Network, the Angelman Syndrome clinics, the database, and what all of this means. So my guest today is our Chief Medical Officer here at the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, I call her Dr. Liz Jalazo. It drives her crazy, but we're just going to go by Liz tonight. Is that okay?
Perfect.
So we have Liz Jalazo on with us tonight. First, Liz, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the people who may be new and don't know who you are?
Wonderful. Well, Amanda, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on tonight. This is really fun, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share more about the Ladder Learning Network and all the exciting things that we're doing. So I guess starting with this first question of what is the Ladder Learning Network, I think really at its core, the Ladder Learning Network is a collaborative group of clinicians, doctors, researchers from across the globe who really strive to provide excellent care to individuals with Angelman syndrome. At our core, that is our mission. And there's a lot of different ways that we go about doing that, but really at its core, our goal is just to provide really excellent, where possible, evidence-based care to individuals with Angelman syndrome across the lifespan.
So let's go back, Liz, because just for our listeners that are listening, just some fun trivia for you, because I always love to add in some fun trivia. But Liz and I actually started at the Angelman Syndrome Foundation board at the same time. So we were diagnosed as mamas, decided we need to do something, went to the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and said, what can we do? And we joined the board together. And at that time, obviously Angelman syndrome clinics were around, but definitely not where we are today, which we'll talk about more in a minute. But I'm just curious, do you, from your perspective, because when you came on really as a clinical expert and helped to bring on to help with this idea of this clinical structure moving forward. But why did ASF start creating clinics in the beginning? Why did they see this as important?
Oh gosh. All right. So back to the early days. We're talking
Yes.
like 2009, 2010,
Yes.
that early trivia. So, I think that, and again, this was before your and I's time with the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, because this was before our kiddos were born and diagnosed. But what was clear when I joined the board in 2017 was that there had been this longstanding commitment to recognizing clinicians that were providing excellent clinical care and supporting those clinicians. So the very first two clinics that were funded and supported as Angelman Syndrome Foundation clinics were Mass General, the team up at Mass General with led by Ron Thiebert, and then the clinic at UNC. Ron is absolutely a legend. For sure. And then the team down at UNC. And really, that clinical team was largely led by Ann Wheeler, who's a psychologist, and Margaret Doremus, who is also a legendary speech language pathologist. So, I think the Angelman Syndrome Foundation recognizes that there were these two kind of hubs of clinical care at that time. Again, this was, 10, 12 years ago, and said, we need to support these folks to be able to do more of what they're doing really well.
Well, I think the one thing we hear a lot at the foundation, and you hear a lot as well, is one of the most frustrating thing as a parent is going to clinicians or going to a neurologist, going, to any sort of clinical care and having to explain Angelman syndrome to, the people who should already know how to treat that. So I think that was one of the things that I thought was so cool about this idea of a clinical having clinics is that you can go and you don't have to be the doctor, right? You are going somewhere where they know Angelman syndrome. They have studied it. They have people researching it in facilities right in the other building. And it
Yep.
just is such a kind of a weight off of a parent's shoulder to be able to sit down and be given a plan of clinical care instead of you giving the plan to the clinician.
Absolutely. 100%. I'm sure any parent that I've talked to knows the story, and I've probably told it too many times. But when Evelyn was diagnosed, we were at a really good hospital, a really major academic medical center with really good pediatric epileptologists who didn't know Angelman syndrome, right? And that set us off on this journey of finding care providers that did know Angelman syndrome. And it's still, to this day, gives me chills when I'm sitting in the room at the end of a long clinic day, because I will not lie, some of these clinic days are long and exhausting for families. But when a family says, when they express, like, this is the first time that we've walked in a room and everybody just got it, right? Like the clinicians know Angelman syndrome. They know it inside and out. They can tell you, yes, this is normal. This is what we expect. And here's what we know works. Or, your kid is doing X, Y, and Z. That's amazing. That's exactly where I expect them to be. Or perhaps it's not where I expect them to be. And this is what we need to do to get there. That's just a game changer for families who 9 times out of 10 are going to be the expert in every medical room, right? Really, regardless of where you are outside of these clinics.
Yeah, that's why I think it was brilliant in the minds of the people who came way before us to think about this idea, because I think, fast forward to where we are today, and these clinics serve such an important function of clinical care. But now as we're moving into these clinical trials, they're starting to serve a whole other purpose, right? So I want to talk a little bit about, if in your own words, why where we are right now in the space, these Angelman clinics are so important to the Angelman community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a lot of ways that original vision and the impetus behind supporting these clinics and clinicians remains the same, right? When I came on board in 2017, and saw us through this massive expansion of the clinic network, the primary goal still really was, we've got to provide expert clinical care and make it accessible to everybody, right? The original goal when I joined the board was to have a clinic within 4 hours driving distance of every family.
100%.
Still not there, but
we're getting there.
We're making huge progress towards getting there. But, that's really the goal, is to remove this burden from families so that, they're not having to necessarily get on a plane and travel across the country to seek out this expert care. They can hopefully get in the car and, within a day, a half a day, be able to, show up at a clinic and receive this expert care. But as you mentioned, we've clearly, transitioned also as a community into this incredibly exciting, but also incredibly, daunting era of clinical trials.
Yeah.
And so the clinics have absolutely morphed in and risen to meet a very different need. So that was part of the big idea behind this massive expansion that we underwent in 2019. So when you and I came onto the board in 2017, I think we had 5 clinical sites at that time.
Yeah, if even that, but yeah, I think that was close.
Right. I think we maybe had some brand new sites at that time, getting us to 5. And within, 2 years, 3 years, we had all of a sudden, dramatically expanded, and we're looking at nearly 20 sites domestically. And so that goal was first and foremost to really expand our geographical footprint to be able to serve more families. But we also, like those who came before us, saw this clinical need. The ASF of 2019 saw the need to be able to support clinical trials. We knew they were coming, and we knew that we didn't have the infrastructure in place to be able to support them.
So I'm curious, because a lot of people will ask, well, why does it matter that a clinical trial is done with someone who understands Angelman syndrome? Like clinical trials are done everywhere, right? It doesn't really matter. But why is it important from at least the ASF's perspective and from your perspective as someone who is, who has, in your position at UNC is helping lead, not
Sure.
maybe some of these trials, but other trials. Why is it so important
Sure.
to have them at Angelman clinics?
Yeah. So yes, you are correct that clinical trials happen everywhere in common adult disorders, right? Hypertension trials happen everywhere. Asthma trials happen everywhere. Cancer trials, more and more are happening everywhere. We're seeing more of that happening, leaving the academic institutions or expanding from the academic institutions into more community settings. But in the rare disease world, clinical trials still largely happen at tertiary care centers, right? Major referral academic hospitals, and more at sites where there is clinical expertise. And part of that is just by default. When these drug companies are developing drugs, they're working really closely with those clinical experts from across the country, right? And across the globe. They are leaning heavily on them for rational, clinical trial design, understanding what outcome measures or tests to measure change are actually going to measure change in a patient population. We have to remember that pharmaceutical companies come into this space, with really strong scientific understanding, but very, very little clinical understanding. And so the way that they bridge that gap is through these partnerships with major academic centers. And that's a huge key to the success all the way from planning of the clinical trial through actual implementation and execution of a clinical trial. It's really nearly impossible, I'd argue, for a clinician who doesn't know Angelman syndrome to be very effective at running a clinical trial that involves assessing children with Angelman syndrome. It's really hard to know whether a child has changed if you don't really understand what the baseline of the natural history of the disorder looks like.
Well, and right now, a lot of the biomarkers or endpoints are these assessments, right? And so I think you're right, like having people who have been working with this patient population for so long and understand it, it's kind of key to this. But I also think we also don't 100% know what the reaction of these drugs are going to be with those individuals who are in the trial. So having clinicians that understand, like if there is an event that happens or some sort of illness, whatever it may be, having someone that understands Angelman syndrome to treat that is crucial too, right?
Absolutely. When you've hit the nail on the head there, right? Imagine, so say we have a drug, and by the measures that have been selected by a pharmaceutical company, even in, the best, laid out plan with the clinical experts, say, by those measures, we're not seeing meaningful change. It's really important to have a clinician on board who understands the natural history of the disease and understands the disorder to be able to say, actually, hey guys, I think that we're seeing real meaningful change here, but we're not detecting it on these scales. So let's work together to figure out what the best measure is to be able to detect that meaningful change that we know that we're seeing. And this is where that partnership with families also comes in. And so having clinicians who have a relationship with families who've cared for that individual for years, they know that child or they know that adult with Angelman syndrome, and they can really best say with, the help of the parent, yes, we are seeing meaningful change, even if we're not necessarily detecting it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's one of those things where I think like when you and I came on into these roles in 2019, we had an idea that this was going to be needed, but I think the exciting thing that's happening in the community is how fast it's moving and, making sure that we are, preparing the current clinics that we have to be these sites, but also as they're being sites, still give excellent clinical care to the, to those individuals as well, because it's going to get really busy for our community and for our clinicians moving forward. But I think that, the goal moving forward is to create more of these centers of excellence, these clinics to where one, we can have clinical trials that have access, that are around the US and around the world to have access to more, to take the burden off the families of having to travel so far to do these trials. Because these trials aren't easy. It's not like you go for a day and you're done, right? These are invasive trials that you're traveling a lot for. And so trying to expand and grow these clinics is important. So I will come back to some of that, because I think everything we talked about is so important in so many ways to the mission of ASF as we grow these clinics, because clinics have become such a staple of what we're doing. But a lot of families ask us when we are announcing new clinics, when we're, talking about new clinics, how does ASF decide where we're establishing new clinics, and, what city they should be in, or how that even happens? I mean, I can say for, since I've been here, a lot of families have a lot of power in this as well. They'll reach out, they'll say, we have an amazing neurologist that sees multiple angels. We really feel like they would be a great site. Can you get moving on this? But I also think there's a lot of these rare disease centers of excellence around the world now that we're tapping into, right? That have this expertise. But from your perspective as being the leader of this work here for the ASF, how does the ASF decide to establish a new clinic, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned a few of the ways. So, in my mind, there's kind of three different ways that this selection process happens. So the first of which is what you said. We have a family who comes to us and they say, we see a wonderful neurologist or a wonderful geneticist or, some fabulous clinician that has really stepped up and is caring for many individuals with Angelman syndrome in that community. Oftentimes through a partnership with a family, we will approach that clinician about their interest in joining the network. So that's kind of the first pathway. Other times, a clinician will approach us that maybe we haven't heard as much about. Perhaps, they've been at another institution, they've been training with other individuals who've been active in the space for years. They've seen some of the work that the Ladder Learning Network was doing and they were excited about it. And in that scenario, what we'll typically do is we'll look at the map, we'll see, is this a geographic area that's in need? If it is, and, we've got an activated clinician who's willing to champion this, because this takes a ton of work on the part of the clinician, then, we'll typically go there. The third way that we can go about establishing a clinic is, if we as the foundation are recognizing that there's an area of need. So if there's a big geographic hole, we will oftentimes solicit in that area. We'll solicit to families. We'll say, hey, who are you seeing? Who do you love? Who's been really fabulous? And we'll approach those clinicians. I'm not going to lie, again, because of how much work this takes, it's sometimes can be challenging to get, to find that champion. In an area of high need. But really what, that kind of the thread that runs through that is the need for a really strong champion. What rises to the top is these clinicians who, for one reason or another, have decided that this is what they want to do with their career. And they're not doing this exclusively. They're adding this to their already full plate, their busy agenda, and they're saying, this is a community that I want to serve. And, we hear a ton of different reasons that a clinician may have come to that decision, but those are kind of the three routes that get us to the same place of selecting a new clinic.
Yeah. And just, from the perspective of the ASF and the board, we've continuously looked at our heat map of where the population is really heavy and where there is a gap. And I can tell you now, we've been working really hard on like the Utah, Seattle area. So if anybody's listening to this podcast right now and has any recommendations, please let us know, because we've been working on this for multiple years now in those locations. We are looking and seeing like where are those high areas of needs. And so when you hear us announce new clinics, in new areas, and you may be frustrated because you're like, listen, we've needed one here for 2 years. Like, what's going on? Keep in mind, it's probably not because we haven't tried. We don't want to just bring anyone on, right? Like we don't just say, hey, you've never, we need a clinic in this area, but you've never heard of Angelman syndrome before, but let's just see what happens. Like, we don't want to do that, right? So we have to be incredibly careful of what we do. So I if you're listening, and I would ask you to be very patient when we do announce them. If it's not in your area, more, 9 times out of 10, we're looking and we're working really hard to get one in that area for you. And reach out to me and Liz. We love talking to families. We love trying to solve the problem and find clinicians in the space. Liz is fantastic at recruiting and bringing them on and enticing them to come on. Cause you're right. We have clinicians, most of them, this is just a very small percentage of what they do every day, for their job. And so I would encourage you all to reach out and let us know, if there is someone to help us so we can get that moving. And I have to put a plug in too. This is not a cheap endeavor. Bringing on clinics costs dollars for the foundation. And it's not just a 1-year thing. We want to sustain these clinics because if and when a treatment comes along, these clinics are going to be essential as well. Right, Liz?
Absolutely. Can
you say why a little bit?
Sure. I mean, these treatments, at least the ones that are in the clinical pipeline right now, these ASOs or antisense oligonucleotides, they're delivered by spinal tap, by spinal injection right now. And so this isn't going to be a medication that your doctor can prescribe and you go pick up at CVS. Unfortunately, we all, dream of the day that that's what kind of intervention we're talking about. But, Angelman is a neurological disorder. And so for now, we are eternally grateful that we're looking at these options, but the options, do require sedation. They require a certain level of medical care that, is not likely just to be available at every, neighborhood community hospital. So, the clinics are really going to have a tall order in front of them if and when therapeutics are approved, and we are looking at, being able to expand, deliver medications to every individual with Angelman syndrome who desires one.
Yeah. As well as still giving the excellent clinical care, right? And monitoring.
Absolutely.
And still doing trials, because I'm sure we'll still be doing, moving into gene therapy trials. And
absolutely.
So yeah, they're going to be incredibly busy.
We're at the very edge of this frontier, right? And, we are talking about this all day, every day. We had a network leadership call today, and, we were talking about the need to, very quickly here, call together a meeting of the network just to discuss capacity. Where are the pain points? We know that sites are stretched with clinical trials right now, but we have to ensure that clinical care doesn't fall by the wayside. We have to ensure that we're continuing to build capacity to be able to care for the clinical needs of patients and not just focus on clinical trials. And we have to be building, the capacity to be able to run more clinical trials, whether that's adding additional sites or expanding the capacity at existing sites to be able to execute that, because there are no shortage of clinical trials coming down the pipeline in the next 5 years. And so we're, continually looking 5-10 years ahead of us to say, what's the need going to be and how do we make sure that we're there to meet that need?
Yeah. So no pressure on our shoulders over here, but we will continue to work really hard to make sure, I think our theme moving forward is how we, sustain and grow and build a solid foundation in order to support the families moving forward when it comes to, continued family support, continued work through our clinical network, and continue investing in, high quality research. I think that the whole goal is how do we sustain it? Because we can create these quickly and get them out there, but, putting a clinic in an area that we can't sustain and then ripping that clinic away from families is the worst thing.
That's a disaster.
That's a disaster. Yep. We don't want that to happen. So
we can't do that.
So like I said, I have to repeat it again. If you hear us announce a clinic and it's not in your area, please don't be discouraged. Reach out to us, ask us questions, challenge us, say, have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? Because most of the times, these clinics have been established because families reach out and say, hey, I think you should look at this person. Are you struggling to find a doctor who really understands your loved one with Angelman syndrome? As a parent of a child with AS, I know firsthand how frustrating that can be. That's why we have established ASF clinics by partnering with leading medical and research institutions to provide expert, comprehensive, and evidence-based medical care dedicated to individuals with Angelman syndrome. We know access to specialized care is essential for your loved one to thrive. We have 23 locations in the United States, 6 globally, and with many more to come. Find a clinic near you at angelman.org/clinics. So really quickly, I'm kind of all over the board here, though. I think another thing I'd like to bring up for people who are listening is we often get, one of our big focuses moving forward as well is, establishing really good support for our individuals who are adults living with Angelman syndrome. Mm-hmm. And sometimes a lot of what we hear is our clinics not being able to see see adults. So can you help kind of the listener understand why some of our clinics can only see pediatrics, why some of them only see adults, or what that looks like?
Sure. So just the plain and simple answer is, if a clinic is housed within a pediatric hospital or a children's center, oftentimes there are age limits. A hard and fast, we aren't able to see patients after they turn 18. It's usually not 18 in the US. It's usually a little bit older, particularly for individuals with developmental disabilities. Many children's hospitals will see adults, young adults into their early 20s, 23, 25 even. But oftentimes even that requires kind of special permission from, leadership within a hospital. So, knowing that we have in many of the metropolitan areas, there are, a lot of individuals across the lifespan. Oftentimes where we're finding these clinical experts is within the children's hospitals. And so, not wanting to completely lose that opportunity to have a clinical expert and have a network site there, we will, allow a site that is a children's hospital to join the network. But one requirement that we are pretty firm about is if you're not going to be able to see adult patients or adult individuals with Angelman syndrome, we need to have a game plan we need to be very transparent about what that age cutoff is, and that needs to be available on the website. But you need to know who your referral recommendations are for adults. So perhaps the geneticist is able to see the individual who's an adult with Angelman syndrome, but, the neurologist won't be able to, or, any of the other various specialists. We do ask that the clinics that are in pediatric hospitals have a set of adult providers that they refer to, and that they can kind of endorse as referrals. So this is, we also don't want people to feel like they can't establish care at a clinic if they're approaching that transition point. Exactly. So we want people to be able to receive care as long as they possibly can within the pediatric healthcare system, and then know what that transition plan looks like. Because we know this is incredibly challenging, and all of these, valuable resources are often lost or become far fewer in adulthood. And so we absolutely don't want to add healthcare as an additional resource that's lost in that adult transition.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that we've heard very loudly in the last couple of years is, our adult population and the families and the caregivers are supporting them feel like they're not getting the resources they need. Yep. And they've paved such a way for us as,
absolutely
a younger families. And so that is definitely something we're working really hard here at the ASF. And I will tell you, we'll be announcing this soon, but I'm excited to say that we are with one of our newer clinics coming on, going to pilot testing an adult transition model, because I think if we can establish a really good model of that, we're looking at when it comes to transitioning care in these clinics, that it's something that we can, hopefully establish in all of our clinics moving forward, because that's something that's really important for us. So stay tuned and to learn more about that as we move forward. So a couple more questions and then I'll let you go. But I think, we've been talking a lot about using the term ladder learning network. Probably should have started the conversation with this, but can you help people understand what the ladder learning network actually is and what are kind of the 3 things that fall under that?
Sure. So the ladder learning network. So ladder stands for Linking Angelman and Duke 15 data for expanded research. And that is the name of our database, which we will get to in just a second. But the Ladder Learning Network, like I said, is really this collaborative group of clinicians and researchers from across the globe who are really focused on really three main areas. So the first, like we've talked a lot about tonight, is ensuring access to excellent clinical care. The next is really focusing on clinical research. And a big part of focusing on clinical research is our Ladder database. So the Ladder database is something that is operated by the Ladder Learning Network. It is a joint effort between the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and the Duke 15Q Alliance. And the Ladder database was really born, again, kind of in this critical transition period in 2019, when we recognized that we already had a good number of clinics in the US, but we were all of a sudden about to be expanding and, have a much larger geographical footprint. When individuals are seen in a clinic for clinical care, part of that good clinical care is collecting a lot of clinical information. And as it stood prior to 2019, you would, go visit a clinic, provide that clinical information about your loved one with Angelman syndrome, and it would kind of disappear into the ether at that academic institution, never to be seen again, only for you to have to put it out on paper the next year when you were seen at that clinic or at another clinic. And so really born out of that idea that parents were contributing this data that wasn't being utilized and wasn't accessible, we designed the Ladder database. And the goal was really to harness the power of all of that clinical data that was being captured in academic institutions and these clinical sites across the country. And so the goal now is that when you are seen at a clinic, if you consent to have your child or loved one, their data captured in the Ladder database, that data is then accessible for many, many different uses. It is accessible for drug development. So, talk about wanting to expedite therapeutic development. The Ladder database is, moving us light years ahead in being able to provide natural history data to drug developers that are, need that critical data to be able to develop their therapeutic. It can be utilized, again, with your consent by, clinicians who are doing research. There's recently been an interest in, thinking about developing Angelman specific growth curves. So projects like that are made possible and feasible by participating in the Ladder database. So that's kind of the second tier is clinical research and the Ladder database. And then this third pillar of the Ladder Learning Network is supporting clinical trials. And we've talked a lot about that tonight and the importance of why clinical experts are necessary for clinical trials to be successful.
Well, I think a couple of things to mention as well is that, back to the Ladder database, we have to give a shout out to the natural history study and that team who has worked for many years to collect amazing data. And now that they've given it to the Ladder database and they're putting their data in there that will help just increase the value of that data. We're also working really hard with the Global Angelman Registry because that's a great parent registry. That's an international registry, and working on ways that we can connect all of these data points, all over the place that have been siloed for so many years and bring them together to make it usable. So if anyone ever wonders, like, should I enroll in Ladder? Should I enroll in the natural history study or the Global Angelman Registry? The answer should always be yes. Go for it. It takes a little bit of your time, but that the time that you're contributing it to doing that is incredibly impactful to the landscape of treatments, the landscape of, understanding the clinical needs of those living with Angelman syndrome. So I would encourage you to do that, especially if you've been to a clinic, thinking of going to a clinic. You can enroll anytime. They're going to ask you to do it anyway, so you might as well get on top of it. And if you've ever been to a clinic and haven't been back, go ahead and enroll as well. laddertotreatment.org. Enroll in there and enter that information. There's surveys in there. There's ways for you to contribute to research that's important. The other thing I think that is really important about this network that people may not know is that every month, all of these clinicians from all over the world, not the US. I think it's important for people to understand we don't have clinics just here in the US. We support clinics internationally, and those are growing as well as we're continuing to see the need internationally for this expert clinical care. What are these clinicians doing monthly?
Gathering far past their bedtime to join us on clinic calls. I mean, oftentimes we'll end up with a 4 p.m. call that might be, reasonable for all the Pacific Mountain and Eastern timeframes, but we end up with clinicians. I'm always continually amazed and humbled by the dedication of some of our European clinic sites,
right.
The crew from the Netherlands that will oftentimes be on at midnight, or the crew from Israel that will be on really in the middle of the night, because they feel passionately about whatever the topic is that we're talking about. So, each meeting is focused on a specific topic. Our upcoming meeting is talking about EEG in Angelman and Duke15q syndromes, and really focusing on how we can use EEG, across the board, whether it's looking at EEG as a biomarker, EEG as a tool in the diagnostic odyssey, EEG as a marker of, improvement, clinical improvement as a marker of cognition. So this call will bring together clinicians from across the world, but also researchers who, they have spent their careers working on this. And so really the goal is to advance the knowledge, really get the expertise out of these, few academic centers that have seen hundreds of individuals with Angelman syndrome, and disseminate that across the world so that everybody has access to the same evidence-based medicine.
It's really cool for someone who does not have a medical mind, which is definitely me, sitting on these calls and seeing, sometimes there's 50 or 60, 70, people on these calls, talking about challenging cases, talking about challenging symptoms of Angelman syndrome and how they're treating them. And it's just remarkable to see the dedication of these clinicians coming together. And it's just, I'm always in awe of it. And it's growing and growing because so many more, clinicians are wanting to get engaged. And the really cool thing, you mentioned this early, Liz, but I have to mention it, that some of our newer clinics that are coming on, is particular 2 of them, the individuals that are leading them studied under some of our most senior clinicians now. I love this, Liz. I love seeing that these fellows and these people who have been working so hard, studying Angelman syndrome, decide that, they've now, I don't know, you're a medical person, they don't know, graduate, but now they have, I don't know, they go on and do, their job somewhere else, and they're establishing these clinics that are Angelman because they studied under doctors. It's amazing.
Well, I think it's a testament to how awesome our community is also, how awesome and infectious our kids and adults are, right? I mean, it's our community, I think, can get its hooks in people and suck them in, which is awesome. It's awesome.
I 100% agree. So I know we could go on for hours and hours, but just maybe one more question, because I've had you for so long. We, and this, I don't know, this might be not a challenging question, but I think it's important based on the landscape that we're in now. A lot of people reach out to the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, reach out to industry and say, I want to be in these trials. I want to be in these trials. And, I know that there's been a lot of talk in the community about these waiting lists at the clinics, and that, the only way you could get into a trial is if you go to a clinic, or if you do this, or if you do that. And so I guess if you could maybe shed some light on, one, if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, like what you should do. I know that a lot of the industry will say, here's the number you should reach out to. And just to be transparent, a lot of them have a script that they go by that makes it challenging. So what advice would you give to the community about, if you really are interested in participating in a trial, what you should do?
Yeah. And I get this question a lot in clinic. It's so hard, the spots, because we are in safety trials right now, and this will not always be the case. I think there will come a day that there are enough spots for everybody who wants to participate. But the phase of studies that we are in right now is these safety trials. Safety trials by nature are small. They're just not huge. There's not huge numbers of spots available. I mean, sometimes in some of these trials, there might be 5 spots available across the whole United States, right? There might be 12 spots across the world that are available.
Yeah.
So if my best advice for families who are interested in participating in clinical trials or clinical research, if you don't want to miss an opportunity, there's a couple of things. First and foremost, staying in touch with the Angelman Syndrome Foundation, following us on social media, receiving emails, being in the contact registry, all of those things, you won't miss a new clinical trial opportunity coming out. You won't miss updates, community updates from these clinical trials. But really, like nuts and bolts, what do you need to do if you want to participate in a clinical trial? You need to reach out to the sites where the clinical trials are being held. Yes, there are numbers for the pharmaceutical companies, and there may be very helpful people on the other end of that, but I agree with you, more often than not, there's a script, right? So I think reaching out to these clinical sites individually, deciding whether participating in a clinical trial is something you'd be willing to travel for is a whole different beast, right? So you might say, yes, I'm interested in knowing about clinical trial opportunities at my clinic sites that are within driving distance, right? Call those clinic sites, tell them that you're interested in being on their list of participants, possible participants for a clinical trial. What's going to happen then, at least at our site at UNC, I know my clinical coordinators probably spend an hour or 2 with every family that calls. They walk them through what the current landscape is. What does all of this, lingo mean about phase 1, 2, phase 2, 3, all of this. So I know we have a fleet of research coordinators out there that are doing this hard work. I know they're all buried because there are so many families who want to participate, which is amazing.
Absolutely.
But I think calling the sites individually, emailing the clinic coordinators, just making sure that you make contact with them so that they know that you're interested. Should the opportunity arise, should a spot pop up for a trial that your loved one might be eligible for.
And if you go to our website, angelman.org, and go to the clinics list, we have detailed out all of that information as far as who you would reach out to. So for the clinics who are actively doing trials, there's information on there who you could reach out and say, hey, tell me more. I'm interested. But yeah, please, and always feel free to reach out to us, either one of us, anyone on our team. And we'd be more than happy to talk you through the process as well as much as we can. I know it's heartbreaking to talk to families who are just so anxious to get in trials and there's so, few slots. And, what I try to encourage families is, keep your head up, keep the hope going, like get engaged, stay involved, stay informed as much as you can, and know that what you've done, you've reached out, you've let them know you're interested, you have done what you can, and just try to stay informed in that way. But I mean, we're parents, right, Liz? We know,
absolutely,
we're desperate as well. Like we understand what families are going through when they so want to be a part of this. And so we feel you, and we're doing, there's only so much obviously we can do at the ASF to make industry move quicker and open up slots, but we can at least get you all the information you need to make that informed decision for you and your family.
Absolutely.
So that was a lot, Liz, and I'm sure that we'll have you on multiple podcasts moving forward. But I think that was a good intro. I think that, in my opinion, these clinics have been like, and I'll say, like a well-kept secret for a long time in some ways, right? And now, now that there's a lot more need in the community, there's a lot more need for the clinics outside of just clinical care. There's just been a lot of questions and a lot of things happening. So I'm hoping that this podcast helped clear up, any of the questions people have. But if you still have questions, feel free to reach out. Feel free to leave a comment. I don't know. Can you comment on podcasts, Liz? I have no clue. Can
No
you leave
idea.
comments?
Sorry.
I don't know. I just listen to true crime. So every time I start doing a podcast, I always want to be like, okay, what's the true crime story going to be in Angelman syndrome today? But because I'm such a true crime junkie, but this is totally different podcast. But I don't know if you can leave a comment, but you can always reach out, ask the questions. We'll do our best to be 100% transparent as we can as we move forward to help through this. But any last things you want to share with the community when it comes to the clinics and the Ladder Learning Network?
Oh, I think just what you said. I think absolutely, if there are questions, reach out, but also if there's feedback, reach out. We know the clinics are not perfect. This is a work in progress. I hope we've made that clear tonight. We didn't, set out to have all the answers. This is a dynamic process. Things are always changing. We're always shifting to meet the needs, and we can't know what those needs are if you don't tell us. So we welcome any and all feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to echo that. Like, we try to keep up as much as we can on feedback, especially through social media. But if you're having trouble getting hold of a clinician or hold of a clinic, or, they're saying that they won't see your individual with Angelman syndrome because of A, B, or C, I left out the biggest thing. If you financially are having trouble getting to a clinic, those are all things that we can help out with if you just reach out and let us know. We have, 3 or 4 people specifically on the team that are just focusing on these clinics. And so make sure you reach out, info@angelman.org. I think everyone knows my cell phone and can get a hold of me at any time during the day to reach out and let us know. And so we can fix that. But also the Family Fund is coming up. It opens up October 1st. And the Family Fund was originally created to get dollars to families who wanted to go to clinics to help get the travel to get there, whatever it may be. So make sure you understand and know that resource that's there for you as well. Well, Liz, as always, I want to thank you for, first of all you do for the community. I don't think a lot of families don't understand the amount of work that you put in, not only for the ASF, but you are a huge part of the UNC clinic, a huge part of the UNC research that's going on there. And what you're doing is incredibly impactful for our community. But I also have to say, and I'm going to get a little cheesy here because I but I can't thank you enough for what you've done for myself and Jackson. And for our family. I don't know how many times I call you and I'm like, I don't know what's going on with Jackson. Please help. And you're like, okay, well, I'm not a neurologist, but because I know that we're not allowed to give out that medication, but I don't know how many times I've called you just in tears of not really knowing what's happening. So you're an amazing resource for this community, but you're such a wonderful friend and a valued key part of this team. So thank you for coming on tonight.
Well, I'm always happy to give mom advice anytime.
Absolutely. I love that you call it mom advice. That's a really good way to put it. Well, thank you. The
side of medical experts.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Liz. We will definitely have you back on future podcasts, but I hope everyone that listened enjoyed, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thanks for listening to the ASF podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support us, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating or review. And please don't forget to subscribe.